The first week of November 1956, inside the residence wing of the White House, Dwight D. Eisenhower stands over a long table scattered with cables, aerial photographs of the Sinai, and the long blue folder marked Western European briefings. The radiator ticks against the cold. A half-empty coffee cup sits beside a stack of Election Day returns he has not yet read. The President of the United States has just been told that 3 of his closest allies have lied to his face, somewhere across the Atlantic. In Paris, London, and Tel Aviv, a secret plan has run its course. Britain, France, and Israel have coordinated an invasion of Egypt, dressed it for the world as 3 separate actions, and are refusing to withdraw from the ground they have taken. This was not diplomatic friction. This was not an allied misunderstanding. This was not a partner's bad day at the negotiating table. This was a conspiracy between 3 governments that had, until that morning, called themselves Friends of Washington. The timing is almost unbelievable. Within 72 hours, Moscow has threatened nuclear reprisals against London and Paris, Soviet tanks have crushed the Hungarian uprising in Budapest, and nearly 300 miles of Egyptian territory have fallen under Israeli control. The full record of who planned what and when will not be fully declassified in London for more than 2 decades. This is the story of what Dwight Eisenhower did in those 10 days of November, what it cost him in private, and what the official histories have always been careful not to say. If you have ever wondered which quiet decisions in quiet rooms actually held the Western alliance together, tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight. And if you are the kind of viewer drawn to real stories about hidden decisions that shaped the modern world, like this video and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. The document that mattered most during those 10 days was a single aerial photograph of the Sinai, and that photograph is still on the table. To understand what was really happening in the Suez crisis of November 1956, you have to understand a secret meeting that took place 3 weeks earlier in a modest villa in a town called Sèvres, just outside Paris. The textbooks would later summarize the affair as a short, regrettable flare-up between old empires and a new Egyptian nationalist. Nasser nationalized the canal in July. Britain and France overreacted. Israel took advantage. The UN stepped in. The flags came down. 6 paragraphs, maybe 8, in most school histories. Inside the White House, almost no one believed that tidy version. What Eisenhower and a small circle of advisors actually saw was a deliberate deception. In late October, at Sèvres, senior officials from Britain, France, and Israel had sat together for 3 days and drafted a coordinated war plan. Israel would strike first across the Sinai. Britain and France would publicly demand that both sides pull back from the canal. When Egypt refused, London and Paris would intervene to seize the canal and, ideally, topple Nasser. The Sèvres Protocol was unsigned by the British, never mentioned in a public communiqué, and never shared with Washington. Only a handful of men even knew it existed. For weeks, therefore, those 3 governments had been quietly lying to the United States, their ambassadors, their foreign ministers, their defense chiefs. The words exchanged in visits to Washington had been steady, reassuring, routine. The words exchanged in Sèvres had been operational. Britain in 1956 was a great power on paper, and a fragile economy in fact. The pound was under pressure. Canal oil was the artery of its domestic fuel supply. Anthony Eden, the prime minister, had watched Hitler rise in the 1930s and refused to be accused, ever again, of appeasing a strong man. To Eden, Nasser was a second Mussolini. France carried its own wound. Algeria was on fire. Paris was convinced Nasser was the patron of the Algerian rebellion. Israel, facing Fedayeen raids from Gaza and a closed straits of Tehran, saw in this alignment a rare chance to push its borders to defensible ground. Each capital had reasons to think Washington would let it pass. Eisenhower was 48 hours from Election Day. Eisenhower was recovering from heart disease and recent surgery. Eisenhower had shown, in earlier crises, a preference for quiet pressure rather than public rebuke. They had read his calendar. They had read his cardiogram. They had read his temperament. On those readings, they were partly right. He did value the alliance. He did fear Soviet penetration into the Middle East. He did want the canal operating and Nasser restrained, but they had missed something essential. Eisenhower, who had commanded the largest coalition in the history of warfare, believed that an alliance that lied to itself was not an alliance. Disagreement he could absorb. Deception he could not. The personal pressure pressed in from every side. Jewish American organizations were calling the White House. Oil executives were calling Dulles at state. His own party was warning him not to look weak against Arab nationalism. Moscow, watching from the Kremlin, was already using Hungarian blood to remind the world that the old rules of great power conduct had been broken before. The shadow of Yelfulta in 1945 was not a metaphor in those rooms. It was the personal memory of several of the men still serving in government. By the third day of November, the situation had stopped being something Washington could manage from behind a door. The first signal that the lies had hardened into a war was a photograph. On October 29th, an Israeli armored column had crossed the Sinai in a fast strike no Allied government had warned Washington about. By the evening of October 31, high-altitude reconnaissance returned a set of images showing British and French carriers steaming toward Port Said and troop transports already in the eastern Mediterranean. Eisenhower received the photographs in a sealed manila folder, carried in by a single aide, late in the evening. He spread them on the long desk under a green reading lamp. He asked the aide to step out. He sat with the images alone for more than an hour. By the next morning, the senior policy rooms in Washington had split along familiar lines. John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, was already in the hospital with the cancer that would kill him, and was sending handwritten notes from Walter Reed in a tight, urgent handwriting that everyone in the building recognized. Dulles urged caution. Support the Allies short of war, he wrote. A public rupture at this moment would hand Gamal Abdel Nasser a victory he had not earned on the battlefield, and would hand Nikita Khrushchev a Middle Eastern opening he had not bought with Soviet blood. Do not give Moscow the script, Dulles warned. The other side of the room pressed in the opposite direction. Sherman Adams, Eisenhower's chief of staff, and Henry Cabot Lodge at the United Nations argued that silence was the one option the United States could not afford. If Washington did not lead a ceasefire resolution at the UN, the Soviets would, and the Soviet version would be written in the language of anti-colonial liberation. If the new Asian and African nations, just emerging from empire, saw Washington quietly forgiving an Anglo-French invasion, the Cold War would be lost not on a battlefield, but in the General Assembly. If the president equivocated now, history would record that American rhetoric about self-determination had run out at the banks of the Suez Canal. Both paths were poison. If he backed the Allies, the United States would own the legitimacy of a secret war launched by three governments against a sovereign Arab state. If he broke with them, he would humiliate his closest wartime partners at the very moment Soviet tanks were firing into university buildings in Budapest. If he did nothing, the initiative would pass either to Moscow or to collapsing cabinets in London and Paris, neither of which was any longer in full control of its own policy. There was no clean outcome. There was only a choice of wounds. The clock ran against him in two registers at once. Politically, Election Day was less than 72 hours away. Pro-Israel voters, pro-Europe voters, Jewish voters, Arab American business voters, Midwestern isolationists, and Catholic Cold Warriors were all listening for a signal he could not safely send in any direction, without offending at least two of the others. Militarily, every hour that passed let British and French paratroopers move closer to dropping on Egyptian soil, let Israeli armor push deeper into Sinai, and let the crisis slide closer to a Soviet-Western collision. On November 5th, a letter from Bulganin in Moscow arrived on Eisenhower's desk, hinting at the use of Soviet missiles against London and Paris if the invasion did not stop. He read the Bulganin letter twice. He put it under the photographs. He went to the window. He sat alone for a long stretch that afternoon, with a glass of water he did not drink, and a cardiogram the White House doctor had slipped into his folder the week before. He took off his glasses. He cleaned them on the edge of a handkerchief. He wrote 3 words in the margin of the most damning Sinai photograph and closed the file. The secretary outside the door would later say she did not hear him shift in the chair for 10 minutes. A near miss had already slipped past unseen. A State Department draft statement, prepared overnight by a junior officer sympathetic to the European desks, had been moving up the chain that very morning. Its central sentence expressed, in diplomatic language, regret at the complexity of the situation and stopped well short of naming any aggressor. The draft was within 3 signatures of the press podium when one of Dulles' deputies, returning from the hospital with fresh notes, caught the phrasing in time and pulled the paper off the chain. Had the statement gone out, the United States would have chosen, by bureaucratic inertia alone, the side Eisenhower was beginning to see he could not stand on. He was told about the draft that night. He thanked the deputy. He said nothing else. He understood very precisely that bureaucracies make their own decisions the moment a president stops deciding first. The decision could no longer be deferred. Just after dawn on November 5, Eisenhower made it. There was no televised address. There was no cabinet consultation. There was no ceremonial communique at all. He issued the core of it in a single private instruction that moved between 2 offices before breakfast. The Treasury Department, working with the International Monetary Fund, was to block any British emergency loan, freeze the oil rescue package that London had been quietly assuming Washington would approve, and let the pound, already falling against the dollar, continue to fall until Eden called. The British financial system was, by that morning, within weeks of real collapse without an American rescue. He let the silence on the rescue be the message. In parallel, Henry Cabot Lodge at the United Nations was told to accept and accelerate the ceasefire resolution that the Soviet delegation was pushing rather than block it. Washington would stand in public view, on the same side of an emergency General Assembly vote as Moscow. For the first time in the Cold War, the 2 superpowers would openly align against 2 Western democracies and a pro-Western Middle Eastern ally. It was an alignment no one in Whitehall had allowed themselves to imagine. The diplomatic cable to Eden, passed through Ambassador Aldrich in London, was short. The instruction to Ben-Gurion, conveyed through the State Department, was shorter. Reduced to its spine, the message London, Paris, and Tel Aviv received that week was this: give the land back or stand without American protection. That was the entire content of the new posture, and it was delivered through the one instrument nobody in Whitehall, or the Quai d'Orsay, had expected the United States to turn against a wartime partner. The dollar. Not a warship, not a speech. The ledger. Eden took the news in his study at number 10. Witnesses later said his face shifted from pink to something closer to clay. He did not argue. He could not. Within days, his cabinet would accept an unconditional British withdrawal, and Eden's own political career would end inside a hospital clinic in Jamaica before the year was out. In Paris, Guy Millet absorbed the same instruction with a drier, Gallic reaction. A long sigh over a telephone line, a short order to the foreign ministry, a quiet decision to blame the Americans publicly while complying privately. In Jerusalem, Ben-Gurion read the cable 3 times and asked his military secretary for the latest map of the Straits of Tiran. Eisenhower, by then, was alone in the upstairs study of the White House residence. He did not come downstairs for dinner that night. He stood by the window, overlooking the dark south lawn. A glass of milk his physician had insisted on sat untouched on the table beside a single folded copy of the Treasury instruction. The lights on the ground floor were already being turned off by the ushers. He looked for a long time at the small red transmitter light on the roof of the old executive office building across the drive. He did not speak. He did not move. A coalition commander had just chosen to break the coalition to save what the coalition was supposed to mean. He thought, in those slow minutes, of the men he had known in 1944 who had trusted him across languages and national pride, and the 1,000 small frictions of a joint command. He thought of Eden in 1942. He thought of Churchill. He did not let himself think of Churchill for long. By morning, the order was already moving down the chain. Treasury officers in Washington informed their British counterparts that no rescue would be authorized. The IMF, taking its cue from the United States, declined to open emergency reserves. In London, the Bank of England was watching sterling drain at a rate that, by the close of trading on November 6th, would force the cabinet to instruct Eden to accept the UN ceasefire without conditions. The Israeli cabinet, reading the cables and watching London crumble in real time, began the slow and painful calculation of how to withdraw from ground that had been taken with the lives of its young conscripts. The world had shifted while the public still saw almost nothing. The UN General Assembly vote, when it came that week, passed with an alignment that would never be repeated. United States and Soviet Union in the same column. Britain, France, Israel in the other. The photographers recorded the tallies and the handshakes and the procedural smiles. The photographs carried no trace of the instruction that had made them possible. The photographs carried no trace of the milk that had gone untouched in the upstairs study. A president had just ended a war. In the first 72 hours after the Treasury instruction moved, no one inside the White House spoke of victory. Eisenhower won re-election by a landslide that same week and did not mention Suez in his acceptance statement. In London, Eden announced a ceasefire he had not been allowed to shape. In Paris, Maulet's government began the slow fracturing that would end the Fourth Republic within 2 years. In Tel Aviv, Ben-Gurion walked the line between compliance and defiance for 4 more months, before finally ordering Israeli forces out of Sinai in March 1957, under a continuing barrage of American pressure. The papers of the week missed most of it. They reported the UN vote. They reported Eden's pale face during the common session. They reported, in a sentence or two, that the American president had taken a firmer line than expected. The Sèvres Protocol would not enter the public record for almost a quarter of a century. The Treasury instruction would not be declassified for longer. The fact that the United States had, for 5 days, stood against 3 of its closest allies and beside the Soviet Union in open General Assembly vote was quietly absorbed into a week the world would mostly remember for Hungary rather than for Egypt. What the public read at the time was not what had happened. The world saw a ceasefire. The world did not see the single sheet of paper that had moved between 2 offices before breakfast on November 5 and made the ceasefire inevitable. The world did not see the glass of milk in the upstairs study. Eisenhower did not celebrate. He left Washington for 2 nights of rest at his Gettysburg farm that his doctors had been begging him to take for a month. He read detective novels. He made himself unavailable to the press. When a reporter pressed him, on his first morning back at the White House, on whether the Suez outcome had been a personal victory, he looked at the reporter for a long beat and said only that the United States had done what allies do when other allies mistake silence for permission. Then he walked past the camera. The personal cost was real, and it arrived slowly. Anthony Eden, whom Eisenhower had known since the North African campaign, never forgave him and died a bitter man. Maulet, whose government collapsed under the weight of the crisis, never wrote to him again. British public opinion turned against Washington for most of the following year. American Jewish organizations condemned the administration in statements Eisenhower kept in a drawer of his desk until the day he left office. A friendship of decades with Winston Churchill, already cooled by retirement, cooled further. Churchill, in private letters to friends, wondered aloud whether the boy from Abilene had ever truly understood the old world at all. What looked, in that upstairs study, like the quiet refusal of a tired president to be lied to, would within a generation become a precedent no American administration could fully walk back. The Suez decision embedded something new in the relationship between Washington and Jerusalem. American support for Israel would be deep, consistent, and often decisive, but it would not be unconditional, and it would not be guaranteed in moments when American strategic interests stood elsewhere. Every president, after Eisenhower, who has ever pressed Jerusalem to return captured land, pause a settlement plan, or accept an unwelcome line on a map has done so standing on a floor laid in 10 days in November of 1956, the shadow of Yalta in 1945, had been the shadow of great powers, deciding the fate of smaller nations behind closed doors. In 1956, a former general of that same war refused, in effect, to let three smaller governments decide the fate of a larger one without telling him. The loop, in its own way, closed 11 years after the Black Sea Conference. History records the speeches Eisenhower did not give. History records the addresses he did not deliver. What history does not mostly record is the glass of milk that went untouched in an upstairs room on a November evening, while three Allied capitals began to understand what a dollar, unspent, can actually cost. If you had been Dwight Eisenhower on the evening of November 4, 1956, with Election Day 48 hours away, a cardiogram in your folder, Soviet tanks grinding into Budapest on one channel, British and French paratroopers dropping on Port Said on another, and three of your closest allies on the telephone pleading for time and discretion, what would you have done? Would you have backed the Allies quietly for the sake of Western unity, at the cost of owning a secret war you had not been shown? Would you have broken with them in public and accepted the humiliation of your oldest partners in front of a watching world? Would you have stalled until the election had passed and let the moment go? Be honest. Tell us in the comments. And if you want to know what happened years later, when Israel tested American patience on a secret of a completely different order, a secret buried in the Negev desert whose name no American reporter was even allowed to print, the next video on your screen is where the story continues. Thank you for listening.